Hello, everybody. Thank you for your time and attention. Please, please don't think for 1 second that I'm doing too much. Like, oh, she just doing this to draw attention. No, I don't do that. This one is going to be a difficult one, folks, but it needs to be heard and discussed. My heart, mind, and soul goes out to those called black men and black women worldwide, particularly in this country called America, that's supposed to be for the land of the free for all. The trauma that the black community has endured is one for the books. What black folks have endured is equivalent to someone being involved in a destructive car wreck. The whole area heard and witnessed the unbelievable carnage. Then someone in authority comes along and says specifically to a black person involved, shake it off and get on your way. You might say that analogy was a little too much. I say the ginormous harms inflicted upon the black community is far more than too much to the 1 millionth power. I know this topic that I'm approaching is hardly a secret. Even though it is no secret, it is a topic that is scarcely talked about, unlike the widely talked about abuse that was inflicted upon black women. Unfortunately, black men were abused by both white men and white women. After reading this article, I've wondered, where do black people start to grieve? When do they start to grieve? Black men have gotten a terrible rap, as well as black women. For far too long, black men have been accused of being sexual predators, even while under the dark sins of slavery. And black women weren't painted under a better light either. Imagine trying to normalize taking care of your loved ones under a system that could do just about any vile, vicious act to you anytime, any day. Then turning around blaming you for their actions by labeling you as always willing and eager to be every white man's whore. There is and was a method to the madness, and a serious mislabeling ensued to attempt to cover up one's known perverted image. It was known just how vile and demented these captors, including their women, were and are. But even still, they have had the ability and the means to mischievously, wickedly tarnish, destroy every black man and black woman's character. Let's begin. In 1787, an enslaved man in Maryland assaulted a free black woman. The story comes to us from the female victim in the incident, Elizabeth Elmwood. One white man, William Holland, had her pull up close and lie down. He then called a Negro man slave and ordered him to pull down his breeches and get upon the said Elmwood and to be great with her. A fourth individual in this horrific scene, a white man named John Pettigrew, operated when Holland pointed a pistol at the unnamed enslaved man and Elizabeth Elmwood. All the while, Holland taunted them both, asking if it was in and if it was sweet. Afterward, William went up into the company and called for water to wash his hands, saying he had been putting a mare to a horse. Scholars have suggested that physical assault can serve as a metaphor for enslavement, thus applying to both men and women who were enslaved. Aliyah Abdur-Rahman argues the vulnerability of all enslaved black persons to nearly every conceivable violation produced and subjected to. The standard scholarly interpretation of how slavery affected black manhood is perhaps best captured by the comments of one former slave, Lewis Clark, who declared that a slave can't be a man because he could not protect his female kin from being sexually assaulted by owners and overseers. Clark's concern, the rape and sexual assault of black women and girls, has been well documented by the historical record. Thelma Jennings and others have analyzed the literal sexual assault of enslaved women in a range of contexts. Physical sexual abuse of women and girls under slavery ranged from acts of punishment to expressions of desire, and from forms of forced reproduction to systems of concubines. Slavery violated the masculinity of black men who were denying the ability to protect vulnerable female dependents. According to Deborah Gray White, those who tried to protect their spouses were themselves abused. The emasculating psyche told, White further argued, could have led men to eschew monogamy or resist marriage altogether. The sexual assault of Elizabeth Elmwood reveals that black manhood was also violated in other ways that are less easily spoken of then and now, namely the sexual exploitation of enslaved men. The historical sexual assault of men and boys is well known, if most unarticulated. The scholarship on early America shows us numerous instances of sexual assault against men and boys. We also know through the handful of extant sodomy cases that males have been also abused. The 17th century Connecticut gentleman Nicholas Simpson, for example, sexually preyed on his male servants. Virtually all of the cases of sodomy that come to the courts in early America involved individuals violating status boundaries, instructors on students, masters on servant. None involved peers. In the context of slavery, literary scholars have shown that sexual abuse of men was part of the Spanish slave system in Cuba. Robert Richmond Ellis argues that the account of former slave Juan Francisco Manzona has commonly been regarded as a searing indictment of a physical mistreatment of slaves, but can also be read as silent testimony to a kind of abuse largely unacknowledged by historians of slavery and critics of slave narratives. The sexual violation of male slaves, as Ellis points out, the topic has largely gone unexplored for a wide variety of reasons, including the obvious barrier of the historical record in that male victims of slave rape left behind no biological record in the form of offspring, as well as the prevalent homophobia in traditional Latin American societies, which would have prevented men from telling their stories, given that male sexual passivity was particularly stigmatized insofar as it was seen as entailing a loss of masculinity. This article uses a wide range of sources on slavery, early American newspapers, court records, slave owners, journals, abolitionist literature, and the testimony of former slaves collected in autobiographies and in interviews to argue that enslaved black men were sexually assaulted by both white men and white women. It finds that sexual assault of enslaved men took a wide variety of forms, including outright physical penetration, assault, forced reproduction, sexual coercion, and manipulation, and psychic abuse. It is difficult to determine with certainty the prevalence of sexual abuse of male slaves. Martha Holtz concludes that the sexual coercion of black men in antebellum America lurked as a possibility regardless of how frequently it came to pass. Anti-slavery movements documented relatively more instances of such abuse than did previous eras. 19th century sources discussing slavery in the South, for example, are more abundant given the abolitionist movement, which drew attention to slavery depravity to argue for the immorality of slavery as an institution. Given the variety of social and cultural barriers to documenting the sexual abuse of enslaved black men, however, it would be an error to assume that the pattern of surviving sources reflects the historical practices of abuse. Indeed, the likelihood that cases would have been documented at all suggests that it would be safe to say that regardless of location and time period, no enslaved man would have been safe from the threat of sexual abuse. In many ways, the cases discussed here have been hidden in plain sight. This article revisits instances that other scholars have cited in their studies of sex and slavery. In particular, it is indebted to Martha Holt's research on antebellum sex between white men and enslaved black men, Thelma Jennings' work on the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, and Deborah Gray White's study of plantation life for enslaved women. Through their painstaking research in slave records, these other scholars showed that the sexual abuse of enslaved women was everywhere. Establishing this now widely accepted conclusion was itself a challenge, for historians had to argue against deep-rooted racist depictions of enslaved women as hypersexual. Turning to the sexual abuse and exploitation of enslaved men builds upon the perspective of this recent literature to challenge the view of black men as hypersexual and white women as passive and asexual. Although scholars have acknowledged the sexual assault of enslaved women, none to my knowledge have highlighted the sexual abuse of enslaved men. In part, we have taken our cues from the 19th century abolitionist writers who drew upon certain gender, race, and class-infused understandings of sexual assault to appeal to a particular audience. As Martha Holtz reminds us, though it was not simply that sex between black men and white women was uninteresting to abolitionists, individuals recognized that it was dangerous to the cause to insult the virtue of Southern white womanhood. In other words, they didn't want to damage the false, made-up, fake image of white women. They wanted to keep them pristine, looking demure and perfect, and had not one impure thought, when it was the complete opposite, while they continued to demean black women and made them out to look like whores. The rape of slave men has also gone unacknowledged because of the current and historical tendency to define rape along gendered lines, making both victims and perpetrators reluctant to discuss male rape. The sexual assault of men dangerously points out cracks in the moral base of patriarchy that asserts men as predators in opposition to the penetrable, whether homosexuals, children, or adult women. This article therefore confronts our own race, class, and gender perceptions of rape and argues that we have a moral imperative to recognize the coerced sexuality of enslaved men as rape. Narrowly defining sexual assault along gender line has obscured our ability to recognize the climate of terror and physical and mental sexual abuse that enslaved black men also endured. The sexual exploitation of enslaved black men took place within a cultural context that fixated on black male bodies with both desire and horror. Sexual assault took a wide variety of forms, but the common factor in all was the legal ownership that enabled control of enslaved body. Winthrop Jordan notes the conflicting messages embraced by Anglo-American culture as it sought to control and circumscribe the bodies of enslaved men and women, on the one hand voicing repulsion of Africans, framing them as beastly, ugly, and unappealing, while on the other hand viewing them as hypersexual. Anglo-American culture has a long-standing view of black men as particularly virile, promiscuous, and lusty. Although this view is consistently framed as a negative one, given Anglo-American cultural norms of moderation and self-control, it is clear that early Americans also saw erotic possibilities and beauty in black bodies. We know, for example, that some slave masters fetishized and objectified women of color, understanding that sexual abuse was about power and not simply expressing sexual desire. The presence of antebellum fetish markets of light-skinned enslaved women in particular has been well documented by scholars. Edwin Baptist, for example, argues that the antebellum domestic slave trade might be reconsidered as a complex of inseparable fetishisms given the slave traders' frequent discussions of the rape of light-skinned enslaved women or fancy maids and their own relentlessly sexualized vision of the trade. The evidence also leads us to speculate that an unusual interest in light-skinned men may have paralleled the more formalized and documented fetish market in fancy maids that Edward Baptist has analyzed. Such an interest is found in testimony presented to the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission (AFIC), which was established by the Secretary of War in 1865 to document the conditions of those freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. White abolitionist Richard J. Hinton, for example, testified that I have never yet found a bright-looking colored man who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled either by his mistress or by white women of the same class to have connection with them. In another case, a man testified that a man who had been brought up in the family was also coerced into sex by his mistress, his family connection suggesting that he was mulatto. So, wait a minute. He was brought up in a family, meaning one of his father and mother was related to the family members that was trying to get him to have sex with him, trying to get him to have sex with her. Incest. We also have some evidence of light-skinned black men as sexually prized. Testimony to the AFIC included reference to light-skinned men as fine-looking. One man told the AFIC it was an extremely common thing among all the handsome mulattoes at the South to have connection with white women. Wow. So regardless of them being related to him, they still, ugh. In the antebellum divorce case of one white couple, Dorothea and Louis Bourne, Dorothea's chosen lover, an enslaved man named Edmund, is described in the records by more than one neighbor as so bright in his color a stranger would take him for a white man. Such testimony raises the possibility that in this patriarchal society, the sexual abuse of nearly white men could enable women to enact radical fantasies of dominance over white men with the knowledge that their victim's body was legally black and enslaved, subject to the women's control. Although we have no evidence for a sexual fetish market in black male flesh, historical scholarship shows us that black male bodies might well be eroticized by white observers. Jordan claims Anglo-Americans culture long held a fascination with the penises of black men and projected both desire and jealousy upon an objectified and disembodied black phallus. Colonial accounts abound with recorded instances of masters and others commenting not only on the nudity of slaves, but on their bodies with a certain fascination. As Philip Morgan reminds us, daily encounters had a sexual dimension, in part because slaves wore little or no clothing. You gotta wonder why the hell these slaves, whether they were children or grown adults, walked around that plantation with little clothes on to none. Okay, let me pull it back. Deep breath. One observer in 1781 named William Feltman remarked on the reaction his nudity might provoke among Virginia women, given that young boys of about 14 and 15 years old were virtually naked. Feltman quipped, "I can assure you it would surprise a person to see these damned black boys, how well they are hung." Numerous abolitionist images also fixated on black male body as perfection, highlighting his muscular bodies and almost pornographic details, exposed buttocks, enduring unjust abuse and degradation. William maintained that the image of whipping exposed male flesh carried homoerotic charge, one that mirrored the nearly obscene fixation on whipping nude enslaved women, as has been suggested by scholars such as Coletta Colligan. John Salient's work on the black male body in early abolitionist literature also contributes to the view that whites found sexual appeal in black male bodies. He notes that his literature idealized black male bodies in a manner that included an unusual focus on height, muscular culture, and skin color. Accounts in late 18th century and early 19th century American publications like the American Universal magazine and the Philadelphia Minerva describe black male characters as the blackest, the best made, the most amiable, beautiful in shape as the Apollo of Belvedere, and tall, shapely. Black men's body could be described as sympathetic tones. Jack knelt down. Not a muscle of his countenance quivered. He was entirely naked and was remarkably muscular and a well-made man. He looked like a fine bronze statue. Again, why were these men walking around this plantation naked when these people who owned slaves and owned plantations had the means and the ability to buy every slave on that plantation clothes? Accounts also discuss the strength of limb, the roundness of muscle, mind, tender affection, sympathy, and efforts to combat slavery. Such details serve to underscore the moral injustice of enslaving these men. It is also worth noting that despite the homoerotic nature of these accounts suggested by their content, women made up the backbone of the abolitionist movement and readily consumed such literature. Accordingly, these descriptions led us to conclude that white women were exposed to cultural ideas about black male beauty, desirability, and physical prowess. Yet at the same time, black men's genitalia were subject to scrutiny and punishment. Castration and other genital mutilations served as punishment in the hands of overseers and owners, as well as in popular depictions of public enforcement of justice. Thus, the Boston Newsletter reported in 1718 the assault of a white woman, but with a focus on black male genitalia that warned off all Negroes meddling with any white woman. A Negro man met aboard an English woman, which he accosted to lie with, stooping down, fearing none behind him. A man observing his design took out his knife before the Negro was aware, cut off all his unruly parts, smacked and smoothed. The Negro jumped up, roaring, and run for his life. The black is now a eunuch, like to recover of his wounds, and doubtless cured from any more such wicked attempts. I say the audacity of these men. The audacity. In 1762, a North Carolina enslaved black man convicted of raping a white woman had his private parts cut off and thrown in his face as part of his execution. And I believe that's true. They would do something like that. While these articles recall the depiction of black men as agents of sexual assault, still then a notion in formation, but one that would long remain in American tradition, they also underscore how punishments for perceived or actual sexual infractions in the hands of whites focused on black male bodies, and in particular in maiming the genitalia of enslaved men. Already in the era of slavery, Anglo-American culture embraced a message about black men as particularly sexual, prone to sensual indulgence and desiring white women. Such messages undoubtedly served to demonize and define the population of black men, but would also have raised the radical possibility for some women of the desirability of such men as highly sexual and accomplished, a model of masculinity that highlighted power, strength, and mastery rather than one of moderation and self-control. Objectification of black men affected bodies and minds. Depiction of sexual prowess and the myth of the black rapist constituted one form of sexual abuse. This myth contributed to the legal and political disenfranchisement of black men from the earliest days of the Republic. Yet the psychic toll was also high, being told that one is hypersexual and cannot be dismissed as mere racist caricaturing. For some men, such messages would have inflicted great emotional pain. Let's take a breather, people. Well, I need to take a breather. And I will come back with part 2. Thank you so much for your time.